Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and many other prophets.
You know, I actually think that we do bring a little joy to the world. Why are we selling ourselves short?
Rick, I think you're absolutely correct. So after 56 episodes of the Haftarah Plethora, I think we'll change the intro. Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we try to bring joy to the world by talking about Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and many other prophets.
Nah, I don't like that. We don't just try, we succeed. You've got to be more positive and decisive. Try it again.
Okay, then. Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we bring a little joy to the world by talking about Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and many other prophets.
That's more like it. A new intro for a new cycle of Haftorot.
Indeed, Rick, because following Simchat Torah, which we just celebrated yesterday, we start again with the entire cycle of Torah readings, beginning with Bereshit, and with another cycle of Haftarot, starting with this week's reading from Isaiah. I'm Larry Herman, this morning sipping some very fine coffee and talking Haftarah with Rick Muller, the king of cannellation, as I do almost every week. So, Rick, how was your Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah celebrations?
Fantastic. On Shmini Atzeret, I got to lay in the library minyan, give a little trop drash. On Simchas Torah, I got to chant the Haftorah, which picks up where the Torah leaves off with the opening of the book of Joshua. And this coming Shabbat, I'm laying again, this time the opening of the Torah, the third triennial, Parsha Bereshit.
Rick, you're in laning and chanting heaven.
Yeah.
But let's also give a big shout out to our friend and technical and musical wizard, Norm Gar, who was honored on Simchat Torah as the Chatan Torah. In addition to helping us out, Norm assists the Torah Club and works tirelessly to ensure that all of Beth Am's recordings and podcasts are available at the click of a link. Kol hakavod, Norm.
A well-deserved honor. I saw another special person around the Torah on Simchas Torah. Wasn't that your granddaughter Millie getting her first aliyah to the Torah on the Kol HaNe'arim moment as Renee Bainwall was being honored?
Yes, indeed, it was a very special moment for Diane and me, which leads us to another edition of It's Millie Time. Rick, you'll recall that last week I told you that Millie had just started eating real food. If you can call rice cereal real food, she wasn't liking it at all.
Yeah, I can see that again. Not a big fan of rice cereal, even from Diane's fingers.
Nope, not at all. But then she was introduced to bananas, and that went over a bit better. The mixture of banana and cereal was even better yet, although she still leaves a lot on her face.
She looks pretty satisfied there.
But the big news is that she's sitting up all by herself and playing with her toys. It happened all at once. She now spends a lot of time examining blocks and shapes. Diane thinks she's going to be an engineer.
In addition to being a musician and a Talmudic scholar?
Why not? With the right encouragement and opportunities, she can do anything she wants. Let's get back to the Haftarah for Bereshit. Rick, sometimes the selection of Haftarah for the Parsha makes perfect sense. Like you're reading Joshua on Simchat Torah just as we finish the last bit of the Torah. Or the pairing of two similar stories like the Akedah and the birth of Samuel on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Or even two similar poems, as with Ha'azinu and David's poem that makes up the Haftarah for Parshat Ha'azinu. but the selection this week for Parshat Bereshit has me stumped. I would have thought that we'd read something related to creation, perhaps to the natural world, or at least related to natural phenomena, or something almost supernatural like much of the reading from Ezekiel. But the Haftarah for this week is from the middle of the book of Isaiah. Explained in our Eitz Chaim Chumash, it's a prophecy addressed to the Judean community in exile in Babylonia.
I think that the real link is in the first two verses, which includes words and images that are reminiscent of the opening of the Torah itself. The first verse starts with, "Thus said God," the big announcement, "the Lord who creates the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what it brings forth, who gave breath to the people upon it and life to those who walk thereon."
I think you're right, Rick. The words Borei Hashamayim and Rokah Haaretz and Noten Neshama all remind us of the first chapter of Bereshit. But the rest of the Haftarah is all specific to the circumstances of the exiled remnant of the Jewish nation. I have to admit, it's very difficult to find a clear and consistent theme in these verses, let alone a message that more than incidentally ties them to the opening Parsha of the entire Torah.
I see what you mean. Even in the explanation given in the Chumash, they don't really get beyond the connection in the first two verses. I see there's one later, I'll tell you about it. But it seems that the Sephardim got the message in just 17 verses, while the Ashkenazim go on for 31.
And it's not as if those last 14 verses that the Ashkenazim chant help us to understand the previous 17. In fact, some commentators think that an entirely new speech starts with verse 18 and continues through to the beginning of chapter 44. It's all very confusing. But I do have a couple of observations before you take over with the trope and some of your other explanations.
Go for it.
Well, for one, we have what seems to be a psalm-like song beginning in verse 10. The introduction of the verse even sounds like a psalm. Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash. Sing to Adonai a new song. The verse starts like Psalm 96 and Psalm 98, both of which we read as part of the Kabbalat Shabbat service. Those words are also found in Psalm 149, which we read every single morning. And the following verses start off like a song of praise. I just want to read a few excerpts from those next three verses. In verse 10, we have his praise from the ends of the earth. Verse 11, let the desert and its towns cry aloud. And verse 12, let them do honor to Adonai. But then the text takes something of a turn after just three verses, taking a darker, more ominous tone. Again, just a couple of excerpts. Verse 13, Adonai goes forth like a warrior, like a fighter. He whips up his rage, he yells, he roars aloud, he charges upon his enemies. In verse 14, now I will scream like a woman in labor. Oy. And verse 15, hills and heights I will scorch.
But then it takes a more positive turn with lines like in 16, I will lead the blind by a road they didn't know. And 18, listen, you who are deaf, you blind ones, look up and see.
True, taken by themselves, verses 10 through 21, starting with Shir Chadash and ending with Adonai chafetz leman siko yadil Torah v'yadir. Adonai desires his vindication, that his teaching or his Torah be made great and glorious, actually holds together as a message, even though it still lacks any connection to Bereshit, in my opinion. But Rick, does that last verse that I just read ring a bell?
I'm sure you're going to ring the bell, so go ahead.
Ding dong. It's the last verse to the Uva L'Tzion prayer that we read every weekday at the end of Shacharit and at other times as well. Yet another example of a selection from our Haftorot that has made its way into our daily liturgy. But Rick, I find the rest of chapter 42, only chanted by the Ashkenazim, to be rather downbeat, and the 10 verses of chapter 43 to be completely disconnected. So I'm going to suggest that we read only the Sephardi version, that is, verses 5 through 21 of chapter 42. How's that sound?
That's okay. It cuts down on some of the interesting trope later on, but that's not all that much in the Haftarah to begin with. So how do you propose to split up the reading?
So I want to split it up into small chunks. Let's start with verses 5 through 9, which taken alone more or less announce the Shir Chadash, or the new song. Then you'll chant 10 through 12, which are the introduction to the new song. Verses 13 through 15 speak of God's anger, and then 16 through 21 conclude with God opening the eyes and ears of the people.
Sounds like you managed to make the message coherent after all. Good work. Anyway, we start off with Ko Amar Ha'el Adonai, which has a Gershayim, and then a pasek between the Munach and the Ravia, makes it a Munach Lagarme Ha'el. And this is our usual wake up. I'm going to talk here that Isaiah starts with, his introduction that God is speaking. The Ha'el is separated from Adonai, but it's the same God. We used to call him El, and now we call him Adonai. Then you mentioned we have the words and phrases in verse 5 that remind us of Breshit. In verse 6, we start with the dramatic Darga and Tavir on Ani Adonai. It's the fireworks of God announcing himself.
Rick, verse 6 also has a very interesting phrase. Va'atzarcha ve'etencha levrit am le'or goyim, which also translates as, I preserved you and made you a covenant for peoples and a light of the nations. Kind of setting a high bar for our destiny.
Yeah, and there's a lot of play between light and darkness in verses 6 and 7, which may be yet another connection between this reading and the creation story.
All good. Rick, how about the bracha followed by chanting verses 5 through 9?
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Ko amar ha'el Adonai borei hashamayim benotehem roka ha'aretz b'tze'etzaeha noten neshama la'am alecha v'ruach la'holachim bach. Ani Adonai kiraticha v'tzedek v'achzek biyadecha v'etzorcha v'etencha livrit am le'or goyim liv koach einayim ivrot Lotzi mimasger asir mi beit kele yoshve choshech ani Adonai ushmi uchvodi le'achel lo eten utihilati lapsilim harishonot hineva'u v'chadashot Ani magid beterem titzmachna ashmiya etchem.
So, Rick, I noticed that there aren't any special or rare trope in this next section. What should we look for here?
Well, it's true there aren't any rare trope, but notice the introductory words for each verse and half verse. I love the poetry there. We start with shiru, which means sing. Verse 11 starts with Yisu, which here means to raise your voices. So Shiru, Yisu. And then verse 11 continues in the second part with Yaronu, cry out in joy. Verse 12 starts with Yasimu, which in conjunction with Kavod means to give honor. And then the second part of verse 12 starts with Utihilato, or acclaim. Isaiah uses all these variations on the concept of praising God. That's what these three verses are all about.
Then chant it that way, Rick. Verses 10 through 12.
Shiru l'Adonai, shir chadash, tehilato, miktzeh haaretz, Yordei hayam umloo iyim beyoshvehem Yisu midbar ve'arav chatzerim teshev kedar Yaronu yoshve sela merosh harim yitzvachu Yasimu ladonai kavod utihilato ba'im yagidu.
You know, Rick, there's something very soothing about the trope, about the words, about the way you chanted that last section. I just loved it.
Thanks.
And then in verses 13 through 15, we also lack unusual trope. But as we mentioned earlier, these verses are filled with less positive imagery and words. And these include Ki'ish milchamot, as a man of war, referring to God, or Ya'ir kin'ah, to stir up fury, and then Yaria af yatzriach, to raise the battle cry and to bellow, screaming like a woman in labor. And in verse 15, we have achariv, to lay waste, and then oivish, to make wither or to dry up.
Yeah, the language takes a decidedly negative turn. But as you say, the trope aren't dramatic, so maybe there's a message in that all by itself.
Perhaps. Rick, chant verses 13 through 15.
Adonai kagibor yetze keish milchamot ya'ir kin'ah yaria af yatzriach al oivav yigabar echesheti meolam acharish etapak kayoleda ef'e eshom ve'eshaf Yachad Achariv Harim Ugvaot Vechol Esbam Ovish V'samti Naharot La'im Va'agamim Ovish.
We're going to conclude with verses 16 through 21. And fortunately, we're back in a more hopeful and positive mood.
Right. And note the return to the imagery of transforming darkness to light. There's your Breshit connection. It's clearly there in verse 16, especially in the line, Asim the Telisha Kitana, Machshach Lifnehem, your favorite Kadma V'Azla, and then La'or, to light. So going from Choshech, that's in the word Machshach there, from Choshech to Or, from darkness to light. That's the creation right there. I want to go back just for a second. You also had Choshech before, people in verse 7, people in a dungeon, people sitting in darkness. So it works there too, that it's a message to people who are depressed or who are literally in prison of their own making or whatever, but to bring them out into light. So I just noticed that since yesterday when we talked about it. But the special trope here also highlight the creation story.
Rick, you've done it. You've shown us the clear and coherent connection between the Haftarah and the Parsha.
Well, we've done it together, buddy. That's the evruta method.
That's fantastic. So Rick, chant the last verses 16 through 21, and take us home.
V'holachti ivrim b'derech lo yada'u b'ntivot lo yadu adrichem asim mashach lifnehem la'or uma'akashim lemishor ele hadvarim Asitim velo azavtim nasogu achor yevo shuvoshet habotchim bapasel haomrim lemasecha atem Eloheinu hachershim Shema'u v'ha'ivrim habitu lir'ot mi'iver ki imavdi v'cheresh kemalachi eshlach mi'iver kim shulam ve'iver ke'eved Adonai ra'ot rabot velo tishmor pakoach oznaim velo yishma Adonai chafetz lema'an tzidko yagdil Torah beyadir.
Rick, as you were chanting, and I heard that Yativ on Elah in verse 16, and it got me to thinking that Isaiah is emphasizing that these are the promises that God is making. These are the promises of both creation and the promise of the covenant. So well chanted.
Yep.
But once again, we want to tip our hats or our kippot to Norm Gar for being honored as Chatan Torah on Simchat Torah, and for all that he does to keep these Zoomcasts looking and sounding good.
Yeah, we couldn't do it without him. And it was a real honor to be one of the people selected to hold the chuppah for Norm as we walk down the aisle.
Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. I've actually heard from several of our viewers recently, and their positive comments are very much appreciated. Our emails are below, and if you like the Zoomcast, please forward the link to your family and friends. Rick, I don't know about you, but I'm ready for a bit of quiet time, and I'll be traveling to go visit my daughter in Albuquerque, so Haftarah Plethora will be taking a couple of weeks off.
Sounds like a good plan. Nesiyat Tova to you and Diane.
Thanks, Rick. Shabbat Shalom, and see you all in a couple of weeks.
Bye-bye.